The security footage was 51 minutes long. Elias Ferrante watched it 3 times before he said a single word. On the screen, 3 men moved through his oceanfront estate in total darkness, trained, precise, utterly confident. They had cut the power, disabled every alarm, and put every one of his men on the floor without firing a single shot. But there was one thing Elias kept rewinding, and kept failing to understand. They walked straight past the study door, past the safe this city had been whispering about for 30 years, and they did not stop. They went upstairs. They headed toward his mother's room. Then the door of that room opened, and the person who stepped into the frame was not a bodyguard, not one of his men. It was the 28-year-old woman. He paid $28 an hour to change a suction line and turn his mother in bed at 3 in the morning. In the 40-page file he kept in his drawer, she was the shortest entry. Night nurse, hourly contract, nothing of note. Elias hit pause, and he sat there a long time in the dark room, looking at the calm face of someone who should have been running. 11 years of running this city had taught him that everyone has a price, that everyone leaves once the price gets high enough, and he had prepared for every betrayal a man like him could imagine. He had never prepared for the possibility that the only person who stayed in that house would be the one person who owed him nothing. If this story reaches you, leave a like so I know you're listening. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it tonight. And don't forget to subscribe, because what comes next is something Elias Ferrante will remember for the rest of his life. At 1:40 in the morning, 11 hours before that recording was watched for the first time, Maren Hollis was kneeling on one knee beside the hospital bed on the 2nd floor, doing the work she'd done for 423 nights in a row. The suction tube ran steadily, the machine making its low, rasping sound, while Adelaide Ferrante lay on her side, with one trembling hand resting on the bed rail, waiting for it to be over. When Maren withdrew the tube, the old woman took one long, deep breath, the kind of breath whose value could only be understood by someone who hadn't been able to swallow her own saliva for 20 days. Maren wiped her mouth, adjusted the pillow, then opened the leather-bound notebook with its corners worn smooth and wrote down the numbers the hospital never asked for and the nursing company never read. Pulse 72. Oxygen saturation 94. Suction at 140. Secretions clear. No blood. She wrote down the things no form had a place for, too. That Adelaide's left hand had been trembling more than the right for the past 3 nights. That she'd left half her evening porridge untouched. That she'd called her husband's name once at 11 o'clock, and then corrected herself. Then Maren closed the notebook, picked up yesterday's local paper, turned to the last page, and began reading the obituaries aloud, while the old woman commented on each person one by one, just as she did every night. That was when the lights went out. They didn't flicker. They didn't dim. They went out completely, all at once, as though someone had pulled a single switch for the entire house. The suction machine died in the middle of a cycle. The control panel mounted on the wall beside the bed went dark with one brief beep, then fell silent. In that absolute darkness, Maren didn't move. She stayed on her heels with the newspaper still open in her hands, and she counted. She'd worked in this house for 14 months, and in those 14 months, she'd learned the house the way a sailor learns the tides, not by studying them, but by surviving inside them. She knew the backup generator always came on after exactly 11 seconds. She knew the sound the ventilation system made when it shifted into night mode. She knew the 3rd floorboard from the bedroom door would creak if someone stepped in the middle of it, and that the 4th swallowed every sound completely. She counted to 11. Then she counted to 20. The generator didn't start. That was the first thing. The second came immediately after, and it was much worse. Inside Maren's head, another clock began to run, and this one didn't measure seconds. It measured what was gathering in the throat of the 71-year-old woman lying half a yard away from her. Adelaide Ferrante could no longer cough up her own secretions. The illness had taken that ability from her the previous spring, quietly, little by little, the way illness always takes things. Without the suction machine, fluid would build up. 12 minutes if tonight was bad, 18 if they were lucky. Maren wouldn't allow herself to think about the 3rd number. She set the newspaper on the floor, and her hand found the manual suction device in the bottom drawer before her eyes had even adjusted to the dark, because she'd rehearsed this in her mind more times than she cared to admit. She suctioned once, thoroughly, cleanly, more slowly than usual, because she had to do it by hand. The old woman endured it without making a sound. Then Maren turned her fully onto her left side, wedged a pillow behind her back, and lowered the head of the bed to an angle she'd worked out long ago, the angle that would let gravity do the work of the machine that had gone dead. She locked the bed wheels, all 4 of them, using her foot in the darkness without needing to look. When she was done, she stood and listened. That was when she understood what was happening, because this house had 6 guards on duty at night, and at any hour there were always at least 2 of them moving. She could track them through her entire shift without even trying. Through the low static of their radios, through their few clipped exchanges, through the footsteps of the second-floor guard passing the bedroom door every 40 minutes, a sound that over 14 months had become the rhythm she used to know where she was in the night. There was no radio static, no footsteps, nothing. Maren Hollis stood in the darkness beside the bed of the mother of the most powerful man in the city, and she realized that during the 2 years she'd spent in a place she never told anyone about, she'd learned something no nursing school ever taught. That silence didn't come in only one kind. There was the silence of a sleeping house. There was the silence of an empty hallway. And then there was the silence that was heavy and dense and deliberate. The kind people created rather than the kind that simply existed. The kind she'd heard once in a place very far away and had promised herself she'd never have to hear again. This was that kind. After about 90 seconds, she heard what she'd been waiting for. Footsteps. But they weren't the footsteps of the second-floor guard. Not that steady rhythm with the slightly heavy heel strike she'd memorized. These footsteps were careful and deliberate, placed by people who'd been taught how to move without being heard, and who were very good at it. Maren closed her eyes so she could hear more clearly, because in the darkness, her eyes only got in the way of her ears. 3 sets of feet. She counted 3, not 2, not 4, and what turned her stomach cold wasn't the number, but the distance between them. Even. Unchanged. No one moving ahead, no one falling behind, the kind of spacing people could maintain only after practicing together many times. They didn't say a single word to one another, which meant they didn't need to, which meant they were professionals. Maren opened her eyes and began calculating, because calculation was the only thing she knew how to do when everything else was bad. The adjoining bathroom had a solid wooden door and a steel bolt she'd tightened herself back in September because it had been loose. She could go in there. She could lock it. With 3 men and no time, that door would hold them for about 4 minutes. Maybe longer if they didn't want to make noise. 4 minutes was a long time. 4 minutes could be everything. But for those 4 minutes, Adelaide Ferrante would be alone on the bed with its wheels locked, turned onto her left side, in the darkness, with the clock inside her throat still running, and no one left in the room to stop it. Maren had suctioned her 4 minutes ago. She had 8 minutes left, maybe 14 if tonight was kind. She stood there and did that subtraction 3 times, and all 3 times the answer was the same. From the bed, the old woman's voice rose, low and clear, and so fully awake that Maren startled, because she'd been silent since the lights went out, and Maren had thought she was asleep or afraid. She wasn't afraid. She said, "You go." Maren didn't answer right away. The old woman continued, "I'm 71 years old, and I've lived longer than I ever thought I deserved to live. You're 28. You go in there, bolt the door, and sit still until morning." Maren stepped closer to the bed, close enough that the old woman could hear her without Maren having to raise her voice, and she said, "You don't get to decide that." The old woman was silent for a few seconds. Then she said, "They pay you $28 an hour." Maren said, "Yes, and tonight is my shift." She heard the old woman's breathing change, something that was almost a laugh and almost wasn't. The sound of a woman who'd spent her entire life in a house where everyone had a price and had just heard someone say no. Maren went to the medicine cabinet mounted on the wall and opened it in the dark from memory. Top shelf on the right, second item in from the edge. She took the pen light, the high-powered one she used every morning to check the old woman's pupillary response. Something no bigger than a pen and bright enough that she always warned Adelaide before turning it on. She took 2 bottles of antiseptic solution, the concentrated kind, both unopened. She took the surgical clamp, steel and heavier than it looked. She took nothing else, because there was nothing else in the medicine cabinet of a sick room worth taking, and because she'd learned long ago that people didn't win with what they held in their hands, but with what they knew that the other person didn't. Her hands were perfectly steady. She noticed that, and she didn't like it, because an ordinary night nurse's hands should have been shaking. Her heart was beating fast, her chest was hot, and something was running down her arms all the way to her fingertips, but she didn't call it fear. She'd learned in a place very far from here that panic was only adrenaline without an address, and the way to deal with it wasn't to fight it, but to give it somewhere to go. She gave it an address. She slipped the penlight into her breast pocket, the 2 bottles of solution into the 2 pockets of her uniform, and held the clamp in her left hand. Then she returned to the bed one last time, pulled the blanket up to the old woman's shoulders, and said softly, "Stay still. Don't call for me no matter what you hear." The old woman caught her wrist, and the grip was weak, trembling, and tighter than Marin expected. She said, "What's your name?" Marin paused for half a beat, because in 14 months no one in this house had ever asked her that. She told her. The old woman repeated it once, slowly, like someone placing something somewhere safe. Then Marin gently freed her wrist, stepped into the hallway, and closed the door behind her. There was one thing those 3 men couldn't possibly have known, and later, when Elias Ferrante watched the recording over and over again, it took him a long time to understand it too. In that entire house, the only person who'd moved through the darkness every night for 14 months was Marin Hollis. She walked from the sick room down to the kitchen for warm water without turning on the lights because the light woke the old woman. She walked to the linen closet at the end of the hallway for clean sheets without turning on the lights because the control panel at the head of the corridor gave a single beep every time someone touched it. And that beep woke the old woman too. 423 nights. The same distance. The same darkness. Her eyes had learned it long before the lights went out. The eyes of the 3 men hadn't. She found the first man near the turn by the linen closet. She heard him before she saw him, and she stood still on the 4th floorboard, the one that swallowed every sound, and waited until he was only 2 steps away. Then, she switched on the pen light and aimed it directly into his face. In a brightly lit room, that light was merely uncomfortable. In a hallway that had been completely dark for nearly 4 minutes, with pupils opened as wide as they could go to gather every trace of remaining light, it was as if someone had welded a white streak directly across his retinas. He didn't scream. Trained people didn't scream. But he lost his sense of direction for about 4 seconds. And 4 seconds was a very long time in the hands of someone who knew what she was doing. Marin knew what she was doing. She'd learned anatomy before she'd learned almost anything else. And anatomy didn't teach people how to cause pain. It taught them which places on the human body could make a person lose control without losing his life. By the time he hit the floor, she was already kneeling beside him with 2 fingers against his neck before she'd even asked herself why she was doing it. Pulse strong, regular, she stood and kept moving. The second man came around from the direction of the stairs, and with him, everything happened completely differently. He looked straight at her. There was enough light spilling in from the window at the far end of the hall for him to see the outline of a woman in a pale gray nursing uniform, holding something small in one hand, standing in the middle of the corridor, and he didn't stop. He hesitated for half a beat, registered her, categorized her, and removed her from the list of things worth worrying about, all within about a third of a second, because she was a nurse, and nurses were furniture. 2 years in the place she never told anyone about had taught her that invisibility wasn't an insult. It was a tactical position. He walked past her, and that was the last mistake he made that night. What happened was fast, and it wasn't pretty. Marin wanted to be clear about that in the private review she later wrote for herself. It looked nothing like anything people saw in movies. It was short, awkward in places, and she paid for it. When he went down, she stood with her back against the wall and breathed through her nose, and she knew immediately that something along her left side was wrong, because every breath became a question her ribcage refused to answer. Her right wrist was swelling so quickly she could feel the pressure tightening beneath her skin. The third man was the one she didn't hit. She heard him downstairs opening the service elevator car, the small elevator the kitchen used to send food trays up to the 2nd floor, and that she used every night to send dirty linens down. He stepped inside to ride up. And Marin, who knew the breaker for that elevator, was inside the electrical box behind the storage room door at the head of the 2nd floor hallway, because she'd had to call a repairman for it back in October. Took 3 steps to it and flipped the switch down. The elevator door closed, and the car stopped between floors. She heard pounding from inside, then shouting, then more pounding. She left it exactly that way. She didn't tie anyone up. With her wrist in that condition, she couldn't have even if she'd wanted to, and she had no intention of trying. Instead, she gathered up what the other 2 men had been carrying, cradled everything against her left arm, walked out through the side door, and dropped it all into the outdoor swimming pool, then stood there for 3 seconds watching it sink to the bottom. She went back inside, locked the 2 connecting doors at opposite ends of the hallway, with the ring of keys she'd been given on her first day of work, because a sick room always had to have its own separate exit, and someone had handed her those keys without giving it a second thought. Then she opened the sick room door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. The old woman was still lying on her left side, awake, without having called out once. Marin went to the bedside and did her job. She checked her pulse. She suctioned her again by hand, more slowly than before, because her left side wouldn't allow anything faster, and the old woman endured it without making a sound. Marin wiped her mouth. She adjusted the pillow. Then she sat down in the chair beside the bed, opened the leather-bound notebook with its worn corners, and wrote down the numbers from the suction at 2:17. When Elias Ferrante's men broke through the door at 3:51 in the morning, they found 2 men unconscious in the second-floor hallway, a third man still pounding against the door of a service elevator trapped between floors, and a woman sitting beside a sickbed, bent over a notebook, writing. The first person through the door was Emmett Doyle, and his hand was already resting on his weapon before his mind had fully understood what he was looking at. 15 years as head of security for this family had taught him to read a room in about half a second, and in that half second, he read it wrong. He saw 2 men lying in the hallway. He saw the elevator door still trembling. He saw one sickroom door closed tight in a house where every other door had been thrown open. Then he pushed that door inward and saw a woman sitting in a chair beside the bed with an open notebook on her lap. And he stood there for 3 full seconds without lowering his hand. Marin looked at him. She said, "Don't turn on the overhead light." She just fell back asleep. Emmett lowered his hand. He stepped back into the hallway and said something very quickly into the radio that had come back to life. And 4 minutes later, Elias Ferrante walked into the room. He'd driven back from the other side of the city, past 2 of his own men lying in the hallway, past the elevator door being pounded from the inside, past the safe no one had touched. Everyone expected him to ask about the break-in. The first thing he said had nothing to do with the break-in. He stood at the foot of the bed and asked, "Is my mother all right?" From the pillow, in the slow, broken voice the illness had left her with, Adelaide Ferrante said, "You're asking the wrong person." Elias turned, and that was the first time in 14 months that he truly looked at the woman sitting in the chair beside his mother's bed. Marin stood up. Standing cost her more than she wanted to show, and she did it by bracing her left hand against the arm of the chair. And Elias noticed that too. He looked at her right wrist, already swelling. He looked at the dried blood on her knee. He looked at the way she stood, slightly tilted, shifting her weight to one side. He said, "Where are you hurt?" She said, "Left ribs, right wrist, a few other places that don't matter." He said, "Those 3 men, you did that." It wasn't exactly a question, and it wasn't exactly a statement. It belonged to some third category she didn't have a name for. She said, "Yes." Silence. He looked around the room once, slowly, with the gaze of a man updating a file inside his head. Then he said, "Why didn't you run?" Marin thought about the answer longer than she needed to. She said, "Because she can't clear her own secretions, and without the machine it has to be done by hand. And if it's done by hand, someone has to stay in the room." Elias said nothing for several seconds. Then he said, "Marin Hollis. Army medic, 68 whiskey, 2 deployments. Grandmother named Nell, 79 years old, room 214, Cranston Nursing Home." He stopped there. He didn't say anything more. And later Marin understood that stopping there had been just as deliberate as starting. She said, "So you know who I am," he said. "I know your file. It's 40 pages long, and it's been sitting in my desk drawer for 14 months. He looked at her. "I've never spoken a single word to you," Marin said. "Are those 2 things different?" Elias Ferrante was silent long enough for her to hear the suction machine running again in the corner of the room, steady and low. Then he said, "Tonight they are." He turned toward the door and spoke to Emmett in an entirely different voice, the voice of a man assigning work, telling him to get Dr. Farrow there immediately, to keep the 3 men in 3 separate rooms and not let any of them speak to one another, and to pull every piece of footage from 11 o'clock that night onward. Emmett left. Elias remained in the doorway for another moment with his back to the room, and Marin watched his shoulders and couldn't read a thing. Then he left. When the door closed, Marin sat back down in the chair, and this time she let sitting be as difficult as it truly was. She opened the notebook to finish the line she'd left incomplete, and she realized that her hand was shaking. Not in the hallway, not while she'd been speaking to him, but now. She let it shake. On the bed, the old woman had opened her eyes at some point. For the past 30 minutes, everyone who'd entered this room had worn the same expression, the expression of someone who'd just seen something that didn't fit the world as they understood it. Emmett had worn it. Elias had worn it. The doctor who was about to walk in would wear it too. Adelaide Ferrante lay on her side against the pillow, watching the woman beside her bed right beneath the glow of the bedside lamp. And she was the only person in that house that night who wasn't surprised at all. She finished telling the story in 11 minutes. He didn't write down a single word, and he didn't take his eyes off her face once. Before that, Dr. Farrow had arrived and done his work in the small sitting room on the 2nd floor, a man in his 50s with cold hands and the kind of silence that belonged to someone who'd spent his entire career patching up people without asking why they'd been broken in the first place. He didn't ask Marin what had happened. He pressed 2 fingers along her rib cage and watched her face instead of his hands, reading the slight flinch, the breath she held back, the instant her jaw tightened to stop a sound she refused to make. 2 are cracked, he said. Maybe 3. Can't be sure without imaging. Wrist fracture. 4 to 6 weeks, she said. 4 weeks will do. Pharaoh looked at her over the rims of his glasses with the expression of a man who'd heard that exact bargain from hundreds of different people in hundreds of different rooms and had stopped feeling anything about it years ago. He wrapped her ribs, splinted her wrist, taped 3 dressings over her knee, left medication and instructions. Then he walked out, but at the sick room door, he stopped. He didn't go inside. He simply stood there, with one hand still holding the strap of his bag, looking into the room where Adelaide Ferrante was sleeping beneath the glow of the bedside lamp, and he stood there longer than a man who'd finished his work had any reason to stand. Emmett Doyle passed him in the hallway, and Pharaoh moved on. No one thought anything of it. Marin didn't either. Not that night. Elias Ferrante's office looked nothing like what she'd imagined during 14 months of cleaning the hallway outside it. Nothing had been arranged to intimidate anyone. There were only bookshelves, a desk with papers stacked in real working piles, a lamp, and 2 chairs facing each other with no table between them. She sat in one of those chairs and told him what had happened, and now she was finished. He let the silence stretch for several seconds. Then he said, "You checked the first man's pulse before you did anything else?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because if he was dead, the equation changed. A dead man means someone wasn't careful. Careful people are easier to predict." Elias Ferrante slowly turned the glass in his hand, though he hadn't taken a single sip from it. He said, "Most nurses don't use the word equation," she said. "Most nurses would have been in the bathroom tonight." Something moved at the corner of his mouth and disappeared before it could become anything. He set the glass down on the small table beside his chair. Then he said, "Who trained you?" The question landed without warning, and Marin felt the smallest shift inside herself, the movement of someone who'd been waiting for it all along. She said, "No one." He said, "That's not true." She said, "That's the answer I have." The silence between them had texture. It wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't hostile. It was heavy, like a room where something had just broken and no one had cleaned it up yet. Elias didn't press her. That was what Marin would remember about him later more than anything else from that night, that he could have pressed and chose not to. He said, "For the past 14 months, 28 people have worked in this house. I pay every one of them. I pay a great deal of money to make sure men like the 3 who came tonight never make it to the 2nd floor." He leaned back. "Tonight they made it to the 2nd floor. And the thing that stopped them was someone I pay $28 an hour. You think I'm going to leave that alone?" Marin said, "I understand why you want to know. That's different." His jaw shifted slightly, the smallest movement. She noticed it and filed it away. He said, "You're not afraid of me." She said, "Should I be?" He said, "Most people are." She said, "I've noticed." And she looked directly at him when she said it. Something she could tell didn't happen often enough for him to be used to it. For a moment, something crossed his face that she truly hadn't expected. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the cold calculation she'd prepared herself to meet. It was something that, if she'd read it correctly, might have been the beginning of respect. It made her more careful, not less. Outside the door, in the house where every light had come back on, footsteps moved quickly toward the security room, and Emmett Doyle knocked twice on the wooden door before opening it. The man sitting in the empty room on the 1st floor was the second one, the man who'd walked past Marin in the hallway. He wasn't tied up, and Marin understood that this was both a statement of confidence and a psychological choice, and perhaps both at once. Elias pulled a chair away from the wall, placed it directly in front of him, sat down, and said nothing. He simply looked at the man with the unhurried patience Marin was beginning to understand was one of his real weapons. The man lasted about 20 seconds. He said, "I'm not saying anything. You know how this works." Elias said, "I know how this works. The question is whether you've thought about what comes after." The man said, "I know what comes after." Elias said, "Are you sure?" His voice was perfectly flat, and it was that flatness that did the work. He said, "The man who paid you is going to hear about tonight, whether you tell me anything or not. He's going to hear that 3 of his men made it to the 2nd floor and were stopped by a night nurse. Then he's going to have to decide what that says about the quality of the people he hired." He leaned back slightly. "While you're sitting here saying nothing, somewhere across the city that man is doing the math on whether you're an expense or a loss. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Marin stood near the wall and watched the other man's face process those words. It didn't happen quickly, but she saw it happen. the slow collapse of the script he'd prepared for himself. The moment when he began actually thinking, instead of merely playing the part of a man who didn't care. He said, "It wasn't the safe." Elias's expression didn't change. He said, "Say that again." The man said, "We weren't hired to take anything from the safe. Someone else was handling that part, or there was no part like that at all." He licked his lips. "We were hired to take the old woman." The room fell silent in a way Marin had never heard inside this house before. Elias sat perfectly still. He said, "Take her where?" The man said, "There was an address. We were supposed to receive it after we cleared the gate, not before. That's how the man works with people like us." He said she had to be taken while she was still conscious, taken intact, and if she was harmed in any way, the entire contract was worthless. He looked at Elias. He emphasized that 3 times. Elias asked, "Why?" The man shrugged with one shoulder, the shrug of someone who truly didn't know and genuinely didn't care. He said, "People don't explain things to men like me," but he did say one thing. He said the thing in the safe was a copy, and it was already locked away, while the original could still walk around on its own until recently. Elias said nothing. He sat with that information for a long time. 30 years earlier, when his father died, everyone in this organization had believed the structure had been passed down to the men in the room. No one had thought about the woman standing in the doorway. For 30 years, she'd sat at the dining table in this house and listened to every conversation that passed over it. Every name, every route, every number, every agreement spoken aloud by men who assumed she was busy pouring coffee. She'd never written down a single word. She didn't need to. Elias had lived beside his mother for 34 years without seeing that the most valuable thing in this house wasn't inside the safe the entire city whispered about. It was inside the mind of a woman who was forgetting a little more every day. He stood. He said to Emmett, "Take him back to the room. Keep all 3 of them separate. No one speaks to them until I say so." Then he walked into the hallway and stood there with his back turned, and Marin saw the tension move across his shoulders before settling again. She said, "There's one more thing." He turned. She said, "They knew there was only one person on the night shift." He waited. She said, "Those 3 men came up to the 2nd floor, and not one of them stopped to look for a second caregiver. No one checked the room next door. No one stayed behind to cover the stairs while someone came up from below. They went straight there, as if they already knew there was exactly one old woman in that room and one person watching her." She let the words sit for 2 seconds before finishing. "That's not security information. Alarm layouts, gate codes, guard rotations, all of that is inside your system. But the number of people assigned overnight to one sick room isn't in any system at all. It's on the staffing schedule, and exactly one person makes that schedule every week." Elias Ferrante stood perfectly still in the brightly lit hallway of his own house. And for the first time that night, Marin saw something on his face that wasn't calculation. At 7 o'clock in the morning, 28 people stood in the great hall. The cooks, the housekeepers, 2 gardeners, 3 people who handled paperwork for the family's legitimate businesses, the house manager. They stood in small clusters with the body language of people who'd either been dragged out of sleep or interrupted in the middle of unfinished work, uncertain and not fully awake. Marin stood at the edge of the staircase with her left hand pressed against her bandaged ribs, and she was there not because she'd been summoned, but because she'd told Elias she wanted to stand somewhere she could see the entire room. Elias stood at the front of the hall. He kept it brief. This house was targeted last night. The security system wasn't breached from the outside. It was opened from within. Someone in this house, or someone with access to information only a person inside this house could have, provided the layout, the schedules, and the positioning to a third party. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. A sound moved through the room, not panic, but something more complicated. The sound of people who were frightened, while also wondering whether the person standing beside them might be the one. And while 28 people looked at Elias Ferrante, Marin didn't look at him once. She watched the other 28 faces. She read them exactly the way she'd read patients for 9 years, not by listening to what they said, but by watching what their bodies said for them. The kitchen manager gripped the edge of her apron so tightly her knuckles turned white, breathing shallowly from the top of her chest. The youngest gardener kept glancing toward the door, 3 times in 1 minute. One of the housekeepers was crying silently without seeming to know she was crying. All of those reactions were right. That was what people did when they were told that someone among them had sold the house they were standing in. Then Marin looked at Rosalind Pike, and something didn't fit. She stood straight with both hands at her sides, her face calm. The 54-year-old woman had managed this house for 19 years, made the weekly staffing schedule, and handed Marin her assignment sheet every Monday morning. and Maren looked at her the way a nurse looks at a patient returning for a follow-up after 3 weeks. Her collar sat looser where it used to fit. Her collarbones showed more clearly. She'd lost weight. Not a pound or two, but the kind of weight a person loses after being unable to eat properly for 3 straight weeks. The kind only someone accustomed to reading bodies would notice. Her hands hung at her sides, and her fingers trembled slightly, very slightly, the tremor of someone with nothing to hold, and therefore nothing to hide. And on her right wrist was the old gold watch with the square face. Maren looked at it longer than she intended. In 14 months of receiving the staffing sheet every Monday morning, she'd watched those 2 hands pass the paper across the table more than 50 times, and that watch had always been on the left wrist. People didn't switch the wrist. They wore a watch on after 30 years. They switched only when there was something on the other wrist they didn't want anyone to see. Maren watched for another 2 seconds, then deliberately looked away, because staring at someone you'd just identified was the fastest way to let them know you'd identified them. She let her gaze drift across 3 other faces, paused briefly on one of the gardeners, then lowered her eyes to the floor. She needed to tell Elias. She needed to tell him without Rosalind Pike knowing she'd done it. And she needed to do it within the next few minutes, before the gathering broke up, and the woman had time to do whatever she'd already prepared to do. Maren walked down 3 steps, and positioned herself exactly where Elias's steady sweep of the room would eventually pass. When his eyes reached hers, she held them for 1 beat longer than necessary. His expression didn't change. He didn't look toward the place she'd just been watching. He finished the rest of what he had to say in the same even voice, dismissed everyone, then walked toward the east hallway. Maren waited 4 seconds and followed. She could feel eyes on the back of her neck the entire way, and she didn't turn around. Once they reached the hallway and were out of sight of the hall, Elias stopped. He didn't ask anything. Maren said 4 words. Mrs. Pike, left wrist. It took Emmett Doyle 11 minutes to search the house manager's desk. He didn't tear it apart. He did it the way a man who'd searched hundreds of desks over 15 years did such things, slowly and in order. And he found it in the 2nd drawer, inside a box of safety pins. Beneath the paper lining, a cheap cell phone with a black plastic case. It was fully charged. There was exactly 1 number in the outgoing call history, dialed 19 times over 3 weeks, and the last call had been made at 11:52 the night before, about 1 hour and 40 minutes before every light in the house went out. They brought Rosalind Pike into the small conference room on the 1st floor. The phone lay in the middle of the table. She looked at it and said, "That isn't mine." No one answered. She said it again. "I don't know why that was in my desk." Elias sat across from her. Maren stood beside the window, where she could see Rosalind's face in profile, and Elias's face straight on at the same time. Emmett stood by the door. Elias didn't raise his voice. Throughout that entire conversation, he didn't raise it once, and that was precisely what made it frightening. He said, "I've known you for 19 years, Mrs. Pike." Rosalind's composure cracked, only the thinnest hairline fracture. She said, "Mr. Ferrante, don't." He said, 19 years, and you brought those 3 men to the 2nd floor. You gave them the staffing schedule. You gave them the number of people in the sick room." She said, "I didn't have a choice." He said, "Everyone has a choice." His voice still didn't rise by even a degree, and all the weight lay in the words, not in the volume. He said, "Someone came to you, gave you something, or threatened you with something, and you chose them." Rosalind Pike's hands lay flat against the tabletop and pressed down harder. Her knuckles turned white. Then she said, "They have Wesley." The room absorbed those words. Maren watched Elias's face, and she thought it was the first unguarded moment she'd seen from this man since they'd met. It lasted less than 2 seconds. A very small crack across the surface, and what lay beneath it wasn't what she'd expected. It wasn't anger. It was something older than anger. He said, "Wesley." Rosalind said, "My son. He's 20. He's in his 2nd year of college. He didn't return to his dorm that night, and the next morning I got a phone call." Her voice was doing something very complicated, holding itself together through an effort that left marks on a person. She said, "They told me he was somewhere I wasn't allowed to know, and that if I called the police, if you found out, if you reacted, then—" She didn't finish. Elias asked, "How long?" Rosalind knew what he meant. She said, 24 days. Elias stood. He walked to the window and remained there looking out at the garden, his back to the entire room, and Maren, standing less than half a yard from him, could feel the heat of what was happening inside him. It was the absolute, rigid control of a man holding something enormous still through sheer force of will. He said, 24 days. "You didn't come to me for 24 days. Rosalind said, I couldn't, he said. You can't tell me you couldn't. Something entered his voice then. Not volume, but a change in tone. Something rougher beneath the layer of control. He said, For 24 days your son has been in their hands. And every day you gave them what they asked for. And you didn't come to me. Rosalind looked up. She said, They told me you'd choose the safe over my son. The silence that followed belonged to a category of its own. It was the kind that existed at the exact center of something being broken in a way that could never be repaired. Marin watched Elias turn away from the window. His face had closed again. Whatever had opened there a moment ago had shut so quickly it was almost as if it had never happened. He said to Emmett, Find out who's holding him. Everything, Mrs. Pike knows. Every detail. Every point of contact. Every drop location. Then he looked at Rosalind, and something passed between them that Marin couldn't fully read. Something long and complicated, and layered beneath years she hadn't been there to witness. He said, Then we're going to bring him home. Rosalind Pike's face broke apart. Only for a moment, and it was almost unbearable to look at, relief and shame fighting for the same few square inches of her face. Marin looked away. No one had time to leave the room. The phone lay in the middle of the table, and began to ring with the flat, lifeless sound of a cheap device. No melody, no personality, only a repeating electronic pulse filling the room like a second heartbeat. Rosalind Pike's hands, still resting flat on the tabletop, went completely rigid. Emmett looked at Elias. Elias looked at Marin. She looked at the phone and said, Answer it. Rosalind said, If I answer, then. Marin said, Don't say anything. Let them speak first. Elias picked up the phone, accepted the call, and placed it in the middle of the table with the speaker on. 3 seconds of silence came from the other end. Then a man's voice, even and controlled, and Marin immediately recognized what was strange about it. It had no region. There was nothing in the pronunciation that revealed where the speaker had grown up, where he'd studied, where he'd lived. It wasn't the natural voice of a human being. It was the voice of someone who'd gone to great effort to grind every trace of identity out of himself, the way someone grinds the serial number off a gun. The voice said, The package wasn't delivered. I need an update. Elias looked at Rosalind. An instruction passed between them without a word, and Marin saw the exact moment Rosalind Pike made her decision, the way a person decides when every other choice has already been taken away. She leaned forward. She said, There was a problem. Her voice was astonishingly steady, and that told Marin something about what this woman had been living with for the past 3 weeks. She said, The team was stopped. Silence on the other end. Not the silence of someone reacting. The silence of someone recalculating. Then the voice asked, Stopped by whom? Rosalind looked at Elias. He gave the smallest possible nod. She said, There was someone else in the house they hadn't accounted for. The voice asked, Have you been exposed? Rosalind said, No. Another silence. Longer this time. Then the voice said her name. Only her name. Not as a question, but as a reminder, in the tone of someone accustomed to being answered. It said, You understand what a failure on this scale means for our agreement, don't you? Rosalind's jaw tightened. She said, You told me Wesley was still all right. There was a pause designed to make her uncomfortable. Then the voice said, I'll be in touch. The line went dead. Elias lowered the phone. He placed it on the table with the careful precision of a man handling something he wanted to throw across the room. He stared at the wall for a moment, and Marin watched him absorb the call the way someone absorbs a punch, not avoiding it, simply taking the force of the impact and putting it somewhere. Marin said, He didn't ask where the other 3 men were. Elias turned toward her. She said, A man who just lost 3 people inside your house should have asked first where they were, who had them, whether they'd said anything yet. He didn't ask a single one of those questions. She looked at the phone. He already knew they'd failed. He called to check one thing only, whether Mrs. Pike had been exposed. That wasn't an information call. It was a test call. She paused for a beat, then finished. And this man isn't a middleman. Middlemen don't ask that question. They get paid to move things, and they don't care who gets exposed, because they're not the ones who suffer if that person talks. The man who just called does. From the doorway, Emmett Doyle said, If he already knew the team had been stopped before Mrs. Pike told him, then he didn't hear it from Mrs. Pike. He heard it somewhere else. He let that sit for 2 seconds, which means he has another line inside this house. Those 3 words, another line, silenced the entire room. Rosalind Pike's head snapped up. Elias Ferrante stood perfectly still, and Marin Hollis, standing beside the window with her ribs bandaged and her wrist splinted, began again from the beginning with the calculation she'd thought she'd finished at 4 o'clock that morning, and this time the number came out completely different. They moved downstairs into the room behind the security office, a room Marin had never entered in 14 months of working there. No windows, no internal line, the door secured by a steel bolt that slid into place from the inside. 4 people: Elias, Emmett, Marin, and Rosalind Pike, who in the space of an hour had gone from suspect to reluctant asset, and she wore the expression of someone who understood exactly how conditional that change in status was. Elias waited until he heard the bolt slide into its socket before speaking. He asked, "How did they approach you?" Rosalind said, "A phone call, then a meeting. They knew where I worked, knew how long I'd been here, knew things only someone on the inside could have known." She looked down at her hands. "I asked them why I should believe them," Elias said. "And what did they say?" Rosalind said, "They gave me a name. 3 weeks ago, the very first time, before they even mentioned Wesley. They wanted to prove they really had a way inside, that they weren't just some group trying to scam me for money. The man sitting across from me said someone inside this organization had been working with them for more than a year." She stopped. Elias said, "The name." Rosalind looked up and said, "Bracco." The silence that followed that name was unlike every other silence that had passed through this house since the lights went out. It had weight, a deeply private kind of weight, pressing against all 4 walls. Marin didn't know the name, but she looked at Elias Ferrante's face and saw it pass through something she'd never seen in him before. It wasn't the controlled processing of a man taking in new information. It wasn't a rapid tactical calculation. It was something slower, something with nothing tactical in it at all. Aldo Bracco, chief advisor. The man who'd come to Elias's school on an April afternoon when Elias was 19 to tell him his father was dead, then driven him home without saying a word for the entire 20-minute ride. The man who'd signed papers a 19-year-old didn't know how to sign. The man who'd taught him to drive when he was 14. The man who'd held this entire organization together for the next 4 years, kept it from breaking apart, kept anyone from tearing it into pieces, until Elias was strong enough to sit in his father's place. For 18 years, Bracco had never sat in that chair. For 18 years, he could have. Elias said, "He taught me how to drive." He said it to the floor, not to anyone in the room. Marin let the words sit for 3 seconds, then did what she'd intended to do from the moment she'd entered. She turned to Rosalind and said, "Mrs. Pike," the voice on the phone earlier. Rosalind looked at her. Marin said, "I heard it through the speaker, so I can't be certain, but you've heard it 19 times. Does he pause just before words with an S sound? Very briefly? Less than half a beat? Like he has to gather himself first?" Rosalind Pike sat perfectly still. Then she nodded once, slowly. She said, "Yes, every time. I thought it was the connection." Elias Ferrante closed his eyes. He stood there in the windowless room and closed his eyes, because he'd heard that habit every day for 18 years. At the dinner table, in the car, over the phone at 2 o'clock in the morning when something had gone wrong. Half a beat before every word with an S sound. The lingering effect of a jaw operation Bracco had undergone when he was young. Something the entire organization had heard so often that no one heard it anymore. When Elias opened his eyes, his voice had gone completely flat again. He said, "There is no middleman. There is no hired caller. He made those calls himself. He's sitting somewhere in this city, and he personally dialed my desk 19 times in 3 weeks." At some point, Emmett Doyle had picked up his phone and was speaking into it quickly, efficiently. 2 calls, then 3. When he lowered it, he said, "He's gone. He's not at the office, not at home, not anywhere he's usually supposed to be on a Tuesday morning. My people say he left at around 6 o'clock this morning. His car is still in the garage." Elias said, "He didn't sell information." Marin looked at him. He said, "A man who sells information takes the money and disappears. This man stayed for 18 years, built relationships with every person in my organization, learned every lever, every weakness, every agreement. That outside organization isn't buying information from him. They're financing him in exchange for a share once this is over." He looked at the bolted door. "He isn't coming to take anything. He's coming to sit in the chair he gave up to me 18 years ago." The first thing Elias did after stepping out of that room was issue an order that made Emmett Doyle ask him to repeat it once, just to be certain he'd heard correctly. He said, "From now on, no one enters the sick room except Marin Hollis." Emmett said, "Including medical staff?" Elias said, "Including medical staff, including family, including you. If something needs to be done in that room, she does it, and if she needs anything, it gets left outside the door." Emmett nodded and went to carry out the order, and Marin remained in the hallway with the feeling that something had just been placed on her shoulders, without anyone asking whether she wanted to carry it, but she didn't object. She went upstairs, checked Adelaide, suctioned her once at 9:15, recorded it in the notebook, and while she sat beside the sleeping old woman's bed, she returned to the question that had been catching at the back of her mind ever since the windowless room. If Aldo Bracco had been inside this organization for 18 years, if he could have taken that chair at any point during the 4 years after Elias's father died, if he'd been working with outsiders for more than a year without anyone discovering it, then why now? A man patient enough for that didn't suddenly lose his patience. A man patient enough for that moved only when some other clock had begun to run. Marin opened the medical records cabinet in the corner of the room, something she had the right to access because she was the nurse on duty, and she was the one who needed to know what medications the old woman was taking. She went back to the beginning. She read the way a nurse reads, not looking for a diagnosis, but for something that didn't fit the rhythm. Prescriptions normal, appointment schedule normal, blood tests every 3 months, normal. Then she reached the cognitive assessments. For a patient at this stage, cognitive testing was usually done once every 6 months, sometimes every 3 months if the condition was changing quickly. There were 3 in this file, 3 in 6 weeks. Marin sat perfectly still. She read all 3 again, checked the dates, checked the contents. There was no note explaining why the tests had been repeated. No clinical event between them. No medication change. 3 identical assessments, separated first by 20 days and then by 19, and the scores declined across all 3 along a slope. Anyone who knew how to read them could continue drawing forward. No doctor did that. No one repeated the same assessment 3 times in 6 weeks, unless someone needed to know the rate. Not the condition. The rate. She turned to the signature at the bottom of each assessment. All 3 carried the same signature, written in the same kind of ink, slanting slightly to the right. Dr. Farrow, the man with the cold hands who'd pressed along her rib cage at 4 o'clock that morning and said 2 were cracked, maybe 3. The man who'd stopped at the sick room door on his way out, hadn't stepped inside, had simply stood there with the strap of his bag still in his hand, staring into the room longer than a man who'd finished his work had any reason to stand. Marin closed the file and went downstairs, and she moved faster than her ribs allowed, paying for every step. She found Elias in his office with Emmett. She set the file on the desk, opened it to the exact page, and said, "You asked me why now." Elias looked at her. She said, "This is why. 3 times in 6 weeks. The same test. The same person signing it. No one does that unless someone is paying to have one question answered." Elias lowered his eyes to the page. He didn't ask whether she was sure. He said, "What question?" Marin said, "How much time is left?" The room went silent. She continued in an even voice, the voice of a nurse reporting a clinical measurement. "Memory doesn't disappear all at once. It goes in layers. At the rate shown across these 3 assessments, the thing you're worried about, the structure inside her mind, the names, the routes, the numbers, that's in the layer that goes first." She paused. 6 weeks, maybe 10. After that, no one will be able to get it out of her anymore, including her. Elias Ferrante straightened very slowly. Emmett Doyle said quietly, "He waited more than a year," Marin said. "He wasn't waiting. He was waiting for the right moment. Those are 2 different things. He waited until someone told him time was running out." And she looked at Elias and said the sentence he would remember many times over the weeks that followed. "The countdown isn't Bracco. The countdown is the disease. He's just the first person who looked at it." Emmett left the room to find Dr. Farrow, and when the door closed behind him, Marin remained exactly where she was. Elias noticed. He said, "There's something else." She said, "There is." She pulled out the chair and sat down, and this time, sitting was a little easier than it had been that morning. Not because her ribs hurt any less, but because she'd grown accustomed to the way they hurt. She said, "I want to talk about my position in all of this." Elias sat in the chair across from her. He said, "Go ahead." Marin said, "Last night 3 men came into this house and left it in a way they hadn't planned. The man paying them knew that before Mrs. Pike ever opened her mouth, which means he knows someone stopped them." She let that sit for a beat. "He doesn't know who I am yet, but he'll want to know, and he has someone inside this house he can ask. Within a day, probably less, my name will be written on a piece of paper somewhere in this city." Elias didn't argue. He said, "That's right." Marin said, "Then I'm not safe if I walk out through that gate." He said, "No." She gave one small nod, like someone who'd just confirmed a number. Then she said, "I'm not staying here as an employee under your protection, and I'm not staying as some asset you keep inside the house, because it's safer that way. If I stay, I stay under an agreement, and I want the terms of that agreement clear right now, before this goes any further. Something changed in Elias Ferrante's face, and Marin wasn't sure what it was. He said, "What are your terms?" She said, "First, equal footing. I help you, you help me. You don't hire me, and I don't owe you. When this is over, it's over. I walk out with no debt, no obligation afterward, and you don't come looking for me again unless I agree to it." Elias said, "Second," Marin said, "my grandmother." She gave him the name of the nursing home and the room number, even though she knew he'd already read both in a file 40 pages long sitting in the drawer of the desk he was behind. She said, "I want someone there, not standing inside her room, not wearing anything that makes people look twice, just present in the building and aware of who comes and goes." She paused, and her voice changed slightly, and it was the first time that day Elias had heard it change. She said, "And no one tells her anything. No explanations, no warnings, no mention of my name in any sentence. If anyone asks, it's building maintenance. My grandmother doesn't need to know anything about what's happening in this house." Elias looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "You have my word." Marin said, "I don't know yet what your word is worth." There was no sharpness in the way she said it. She said it the way someone reads a lab result, exactly as it is. Then she said, "I'll find out." For one very brief moment, Marin thought she saw the corner of his mouth move, the same movement that had almost become something in the office before dawn and once again didn't. He stood, went to the door, and called Emmett back in. When Emmett entered, Elias said, "Cranston Nursing Home, room 214, Mrs. Nell Hollis. I want someone there within 2 hours, and I want that person to be the one you'd choose if she were your mother. No approaching the old woman, no speaking to her. Just know who goes in and who comes out." Emmett Doyle didn't ask a single question, but he didn't leave immediately. He stood there 1 beat longer than necessary, and something crossed his face during that beat, brief, guarded, and Marin looked straight at it without being able to read it. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't the irritation of a man being given one more task on a day already overloaded. It was something else. Something almost like the look of a person staring down at a doorway he'd passed through more times than he'd ever admitted. Then he said, "I'll go myself." Elias said, "I need you here." Emmett said, "I'll arrange coverage here, then I'll go myself." He turned away and closed the door behind him, and Marin watched that door for another 2 seconds, then filed that missed beat away in the place where she kept the things she didn't yet have a use for. The plan was drawn up in 7 minutes, and it wasn't pretty, and Marin made peace with that very quickly, because elegant plans required time and resources, and they had neither. Elias would leave in the backup car kept by the garden shed, a vehicle that wasn't registered in his name and carried no tracking device. The hard drive inside the safe, even though it was only a copy and already locked, still had to leave this house, because as long as it remained here, it would remain a reason for someone to come back. It would be handed over to Margaret Sowell, the 63-year-old woman who'd spent 30 years writing about this city, and whom Elias had kept at arm's length for 8 years, because he understood that the day he gave her something real would be the day he crossed a line he could never uncross, and the person who would retrieve the hard drive was Marin. She was the one who suggested it, and she was the one who gave the reason, and no one could argue with it. Every morning at 9 o'clock, she walked through the main hallway carrying a medication tray to collect the old woman's morning prescriptions. 423 mornings. The same hour, the same route. If someone inside this house was watching, a nurse crossing the main hall with a medication tray was the most boring thing that person could possibly see. That was exactly why no one had truly seen her for 14 months. She walked at the same pace she always did, no faster, no slower. The measured rhythm of someone with a list of tasks to finish and a clock to follow. 2 of Elias's men passed her in the hallway, and neither looked at her. She turned into the private wing. She opened the office door using the code he'd recited to her exactly once without repeating it. And she understood that the fact he'd given it to her at all was a kind of trust for which she had no clean name. The safe was hidden behind a section of bookcase that looked exactly like a bookcase. She opened it with the second code. Inside, the hard drive was smaller than she'd expected. A matte black rectangle, thicker than an ordinary USB drive, with a faint green indicator light. She picked it up and slipped it into the pocket of her nursing blouse. She had just closed the bookcase panel when she heard the office door open behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished closing the panel. Then she turned slowly, the medication tray still in her left hand, her face arranged into the exact expression she'd practiced for 14 months. The man standing in the doorway was close to 60, solidly built but settled into age. The kind of man who'd been physically active when he was younger and had never entirely lost the habit of movement. He hadn't slipped inside. He'd walked straight through the front door at 9 o'clock that morning, nodded to the 2 guards in the hall, and passed them. Because he was the family's chief advisor, he had the right to enter any room in this house. And apart from the 4 people who'd sat inside the windowless room, no one yet knew he'd been exposed. He looked at her, looked at the medication tray, looked at the section of bookcase she'd just closed. He said, "Nurse." His voice was polite, almost warm. He said, "I heard about you last night. 3 men, and you alone. That's impressive." Marin didn't answer. He stepped fully into the room, and behind him, out in the hallway, a second man stopped. Younger, large in the way that looked more like a professional qualification than a personal trait. Bracco said, "What's in your pocket?" She said, "Morning medication." He said, "Nurse, I'm 60 years old. Don't make me do this part." He stood about 4 steps away from her. He said, "Give it to me, and you walk out of this house through the front door, and no one asks you a single question." Marin looked at him. She thought of Elias waiting at the garden shed. She thought of 15 minutes, and she'd already used 11. Then she said, "You have Wesley Pike." Bracco stopped, half a beat, right before the name, before the S sound, that tiny moment of gathering himself that Rosalind Pike had heard 19 times and mistaken for a problem with the connection. He heard himself do it. She watched him hear it, and that was when everything went wrong. It happened fast, and it wasn't pretty. And later Marin never told anyone the details. She dropped the medication tray onto the hardwood floor, didn't throw it, simply let it fall, and the crash of metal against wood drew the man in the hallway half a step forward, and that was all she needed. She moved toward the window, not to jump out immediately, but to gain the 13 feet of distance the wall on that side gave her. Bracco was much faster than his age suggested. She registered that fact, and paid for registering it too late. By the time she reached the window, her right hand had lost the ability to do anything useful, and her left ribs had stopped negotiating. But she knew that window. For 423 mornings, she'd opened it to let fresh air into the sick room, and she knew the latch had to be pushed upward before it could be turned, and that the lower left corner of the frame stuck and needed a shove from the hip. She pushed up, she turned, she shoved. The window opened, and the November air struck her face. The drop was about 6.5 feet onto a flower bed hardened by the cold, and she landed badly, unable to control herself with only one working hand, falling hard onto her left side, and the impact tore through her ribs, as though someone had reached inside her body and squeezed. She didn't stop. She planted her left hand against the ground, forced herself upright, and ran. About 650 feet along the base of the wall, through a gap in the hedge she'd passed through 300 times in 14 months without anyone noticing. She covered the entire distance in less than 2 minutes. Elias Ferrante was standing at the east garden gate. He saw her from a distance, and he saw the way she was running. Her left arm clamped tightly against her ribs, her breathing out of control, and he'd already stepped through the gate and started toward her before she could reach him. The safe house was in East Providence, 2 stories, on a residential street that looked no different from any other residential street, purchased through 3 intermediary entities over 7 years. Adelaide was taken there in a private ambulance, with Marin sitting beside her the entire way, and they settled her into a room on the ground floor, with a window overlooking the backyard. By nearly noon, everything had fallen into the tense, quiet rhythm of people waiting. Marin's phone vibrated. Emmett. He didn't call. He texted, "Your grandmother is safe. Nursing home security has been notified. One of my people is inside the building. No one has told her anything." Then, another line arrived about 10 seconds later. She asked if I was her husband. Marin read it and stood up and walked into the kitchen, and she stayed there facing the wall longer than she'd intended. When she turned around, Emmett Doyle had arrived and was standing in the kitchen doorway with his car keys in his hand. And he saw her face, and he didn't say anything. She poured him a cup of coffee. Then she asked him the question she'd been carrying inside herself for 3 years. She said, "Mr. Doyle, you've worked for this family for 15 years. You know things. 3 years ago, some kind of foundation started paying 60% of my grandmother's nursing home bill. They sent me a letter with a seal and a case number saying it was a support program for relatives of veterans. I called the department twice, and no one could find that program anywhere in the system. Then I stopped asking, because I was afraid that if I asked too loudly, Someone would realize they'd made a mistake and cut it off. She looked at him. I've been afraid of that every month for 3 years. Emmett Doyle set the coffee cup down on the kitchen table without taking a drink. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "There is no program." Marin said nothing. He said, 4 years ago, in September, on the number 6 bus running from downtown toward the east side. He spoke slowly, like a man reciting something he'd memorized but had never once said aloud. An old woman collapsed on the floor of the bus. The driver stopped. People gathered around. Someone called for an ambulance. Someone started filming. Everyone else backed away, the way people usually do. He looked up. A young woman sitting several rows behind her got up, walked forward, knelt down on that filthy bus floor, and did what she knew how to do for 11 minutes until the ambulance arrived. She didn't tell anyone who she was. When the paramedics got there, she stood up, got off the bus, and kept walking, because she was on her way to work, and she was already late. Marin stood perfectly still in that kitchen. Emmett said, "That old woman was Adelaide Ferranti." She said nothing. He continued, "She told me to find you. No name, no phone number, just blurry footage from a bus camera and the memory of a woman of 70 who'd only just regained consciousness in a hospital. It took me 4 months. When I finally found you, I gave her a file, and in that file there was one line about an old woman named Nell Hollis in Cranston and a monthly bill of $8,400. He pushed the coffee cup a little farther away. She finished reading, closed the file, and told me to arrange it. She told me not to let you know. She said if you knew, you'd give it back. And she said she'd lived long enough to know there are people who would starve before accepting something they believed they didn't deserve." Marin sat down. She sat the way a person sits when something beneath her feet has suddenly been pulled away. Emmett said, "There's one more thing." He said, 14 months ago, when her condition worsened and she needed a night nurse, they gave her a list of 3 nursing agencies. She didn't choose the agency. She chose the person first, then chose the agency that employed that person, and then she arranged for the night shift at this address to go to that person. He looked at Marin. "She brought you into this house. No one in the house knew, including him." He tipped his head toward the kitchen doorway. Elias Ferrante was standing there. No one knew how long he'd been there. Emmett said, "She told me not to say anything. She didn't tell me I had to lie forever." Marin Hollis sat in silence for a very long time. She thought about 423 nights, about the leather-bound notebook no one had ever read, about the woman who listened every night as Marin read the obituaries aloud and commented on every person, about the trembling hand that had closed around her wrist in the darkness at 1:40 in the morning and asked her name, and she understood that the old woman had known her name for 3 years. She'd asked because she couldn't remember anymore. In the doorway, Elias Ferrante stood watching the woman seated in the kitchen of his house, and realized that the mother he'd believed was simply lying there waiting for him to visit each evening had quietly orchestrated the most important thing that had ever happened inside that house for 3 years, and had never once asked his permission. 40 minutes later, Rosalind Pike's phone rang. She looked at the screen, and her face turned the color of old paper. She said, "I don't know this number." Elias held out his hand. He answered. The voice on the other end wasn't the voice that had been ground flat. This one was younger, male, worn slightly ragged around the edges in the way of someone who'd been awake far too long. It said, "My name is Wesley." Rosalind made a sound and immediately forced it back down. Wesley said, "I've been told to repeat this." And beneath the controlled delivery, Marin could hear the framework holding it up, the way he was reciting something he'd memorized, and working to keep his voice even. He said, "The terms have changed. It's not the hard drive anymore. They want Mr. Ferrante. In exchange for me." Elias said nothing. Wesley said, "They told me my father already agreed." Rosalind said, "No, Wesley, I didn't agree to anything. Elias raised one hand and she stopped. He said into the phone, "Wesley, are you all right?" There was a pause. Then he said, "I'm fine." He said he was fine. His voice was steady, and that was what made Elias tighten his grip on the arm of the chair. Because when a 20-year-old spoke in an even voice after 3.5 weeks, it meant he'd learned how to speak in an even voice, and people didn't learn that in kind places. Elias said, "Wesley, listen to me." He didn't call him son. He didn't call himself uncle. He used his name. He said, "I'm coming to get you. That's what is going to happen. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Silence. Then Wesley said, "They told me." Elias said, "I know what they told you. I want you to hear what I'm telling you." Another pause. Then he said, "Yes." The line went dead. Elias set the phone down on the table, but Marin had already stood up several seconds earlier. She said, Play it again." Elias looked at her. She said, "The end. From where you said his name." There's background noise. They listened again. Beneath the voice, very faintly, there was a low, steady sound. A mechanical thump repeating in cycles of about 3 seconds, accompanied by the distinctive echo of a space with a very high ceiling and concrete walls. Marin listened through once and said, "That's an air compressor. An old one. Single cylinder. Used for industrial refrigeration systems. They're almost never installed anywhere anymore." Emmett asked, "How do you know?" Marin said, "I know that sound." She didn't say why. Emmett watched her for another beat, then let it go, pulled out his phone, and began making calls. Within 20 minutes, he'd narrowed the entire area down to 2 addresses. 2 old cold storage warehouses that still had their original systems intact. One in southern Cranston, the other in Pawtucket near the foot of the bridge. They chose Cranston first because it was closer, and because its lease records matched a corporate entity Emmett didn't recognize. It took them 40 minutes to get there, circle the property once, and discover that the system had been removed in the spring. 40 minutes. Marin sat in the vehicle as they drove back out and said nothing, and she felt every one of those minutes pass through her ribs. By the time they returned to the safe house, the plan had been divided in 2 within 5 minutes. The hard drive still had to leave their possession and reach Margaret's soul, because as long as it remained here, it remained a reason for someone to come looking for this address. Elias would go alone to deliver the drive, leaving Rosalind behind at the safe house to watch over Adelaide, since the older woman could not be left unattended. Marin and Emmett would go to Pawtucket. Elias objected to that exactly once, and Marin cut him off. She said, "You're not sending me anywhere. I'm proposing a resource allocation." He looked at her for 2 seconds, then let it go. At the door, before heading to the car, he stopped. He said, "Be careful." Those were 3 words people said to each other all day without meaning anything by them. He meant them. Marin looked at him and said, "You too," then turned and walked out to the vehicle. None of them saw the true shape of what was happening. Aldo Bracco didn't need Elias Ferrante. He'd had 18 years to take that chair, and he'd never once needed Elias to walk into any room. What he needed was contained in an order issued at nearly 9 o'clock that morning in the first-floor hallway. The order that said no one was allowed into the sick room except Marin Hollis. No medical staff, no family, no one. As long as she remained inside that house, the order remained in force, and there was no way around it. Bracco wasn't trying to break that order. He only needed the person enforcing it to walk out the door. And at 4 o'clock that afternoon, she had. And she was sitting in a pickup truck headed toward Pawtucket. A 40-minute drive from the safe house. The cold storage warehouse in Pawtucket occupied almost an entire city block, its red brick weathered brown through decades of rain and winter, the loading doors sealed shut, a single camera mounted above the ordinary entrance beside them. Emmett drove around the building once without stopping, giving her the angle she needed. On the south wall, in the narrow service alley running between the 2 buildings, there was a basement window below ground level, the top of its frame coming to about knee height. Across it were 4 horizontal steel bars, galvanized, new, fastened into the old brick with bolts as thick as a thumb. Marin watched it as the vehicle passed and said, "The bolt heads face outward." Emmett said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means they installed it from the outside. People only do that when the purpose is to keep someone inside, and it means I can take it apart from the outside." Emmett parked a block away, reached behind the seat, pulled out a canvas roll, and opened it across the seat between them. Wrenches, a socket set with several sizes missing, a pry bar, a flashlight. Marin chose the socket size by sight, the way people learn to do after years of working in places where the tools are never quite the right size, and the job still has to get done. She said, 4 minutes. Then you go around front. Emmett said, "I'm not telling you this is a good plan," she said. "It's the plan we have." The alley lay in the shadow of the neighboring building, narrow enough for a delivery truck. Marin knelt on her right knee, the one that was less damaged, and fitted the socket over the first bolt. Her right hand couldn't grip through the splint. She turned the wrench with her left hand and used her right forearm as a brace for leverage, and every rotation became its own negotiation with her left ribs, a negotiation she lost each time and continued anyway. First bolt, 30 seconds. The second bolt sat at a worse angle, forcing her to lower herself until her face was level with the glass. And through the dirty pane, she saw inside. Concrete walls, a support column, the edge of a folding cot, and the shape of someone sitting on it. For a moment, she stopped breathing. The figure turned toward the window. In the dim light, She saw a young male face, with the expression of someone who'd spent long enough in one room to learn how to sit perfectly still. He saw her. She raised one finger to her lips. He didn't move. He understood immediately. She went back to the bolts. Third bolt. Her wrist had passed beyond what it could reasonably do a long time ago, and now she was compensating with her forearm and shoulder, while her ribs had become one continuous argument she refused to participate in. From the front of the building, very faintly, she heard Emmett Doyle's voice rise, deliberately. The sound of a man creating attention on purpose. She couldn't make out what he was saying. She'd gone past the point where it mattered. The last bolt came free. She grabbed the entire barred frame and pulled. It was heavier than it looked. Solid steel, installed carelessly but securely, and she had to brace one foot against the base of the wall and pull with everything she had. When it came loose, it came all at once, throwing her backward onto the concrete and knocking the last of the air from her lungs. She lay still for 2 seconds. Then she rolled over, pushed herself onto her knees, set the barred frame aside, and looked at the window. Old glass, single pane. She struck it once with the pry bar, covering it with her arm to control the sound of the break, then cleared the inside edge in 3 sweeps. She went down feet first, hanging from the frame with her left hand before letting go, bending her knees as she landed and rolling to spread the impact, and the roll carried her sideways across the concrete floor. She came up on one knee and stayed there while her body finished registering its objections. Wesley Pike had risen from the folding cot. He was taller than she'd expected, visibly thinner, with dark hair like his mother's. And the first thing Maren Hollis did wasn't talk about getting out. The nursing reflex came first. She stood, stepped toward him, placed 2 fingers against his neck, and counted. She swept the flashlight quickly across his eyes once, and watched both pupils constrict evenly. She said, "Are you dizzy?" He said, "No." She said, "When you stand up fast, does everything go dark?" He said, "Yesterday it did. Today it doesn't." She said, "Good." Only then did she say, "My name is Maren. I work with Mr. Ferrante. Your mother asked me to come." Wesley said, "Is my mother all right?" She said, "She's all right." He nodded once and didn't ask anything else, and Maren noticed that. While she checked the edge of the window, he said, "I've gone through my entire biology syllabus in my head." She looked up. He said, "Twice. Even the metabolism section. If I have to go back to school and take the exam Monday, I can still take it." He didn't say it to sound strong. He said it like someone reporting the thing he'd done to keep his mind belonging to himself. Maren said, "Then you're taking that exam Monday." She laced her hands together to make a step and pushed him up first. He was strong, the real strength of a 20-year-old who hadn't yet been completely worn down, and he went through the opening cleanly. She heard him land in the alley. Then it was her turn. There was nothing inside the room to climb. She caught hold of the worn mortar joints in the old brick wall and started upward. On the second grip, she knew. She didn't suspect it. She didn't worry about it. She knew. Her right hand couldn't hold her weight, and it wouldn't be able to for another 4 to 6 weeks. She slid back down and stood at the bottom of the room, and for about 1.5 seconds, she looked directly at the possibility that she'd gotten him out and wouldn't be able to get herself out. Then a hand reached down through the window opening. Wesley said, "Take my hand." She did. He pulled, and he was strong enough, and she came through the opening, and both of them collapsed onto the concrete in the alley and lay there breathing. The rescuer became the one being rescued, and Maren had no time to feel anything about it, because the phone in her pocket was vibrating. Emmett had reached the mouth of the alley. He lifted his own phone, read the message, and Maren watched his face change. He said, "Their vehicle just came through the estate gate. 40 minutes. That was the distance from where she stood back to the house in East Providence. And standing in that alley with both hands still trembling, she understood that all afternoon she'd been led exactly along the path someone else had drawn for her. Those 40 minutes were the longest stretch of time in Maren Hollis's life, and afterward, she couldn't remember anything about the road. She couldn't remember how fast Emmett drove, couldn't remember where they passed, couldn't remember how the November afternoon light fell across the river when they crossed the bridge. What she remembered was the list of things she couldn't do. She couldn't call Elias because he was on his way to deliver the hard drive, and his phone had been turned off for 2 hours, exactly according to the plan she'd agreed with herself. She couldn't call anyone at the safe house because there was no one left there to call. She couldn't do anything for the 71-year-old woman lying in the ground floor room, with the window overlooking the backyard, except sit still in the front seat of an old pickup truck and count. She counted the things she knew. The old woman couldn't clear her own secretions. If someone moved her incorrectly, if they left her lying flat on her back, if they didn't know where to place the pillow behind her, everything could go wrong in 12 minutes. and Marin still had 31 minutes to go. Wesley Pike sat in the back seat and didn't say a single word for the entire drive, and Marin thought he understood, and she was grateful for that. When they arrived, the front door was standing wide open. There was no one in the house. The ground floor room was empty. The bed was no longer where it had been, and for about 2 seconds, Marin stood in the doorway with something white rising through her mind. Then Emmett called to her from the far end of the hallway. The inner room, the small windowless room they used for storage, was closed tight and bolted from the inside, and standing in front of it, her back pressed against the door, both arms spread wide with her hands gripping either side of the frame, was Rosalind Pike. She stood the way a person stands, after deciding that whatever is behind her will not be allowed through. There was a small dried cut on her forehead. Her blouse was torn at one shoulder. When she saw her son enter the hallway, her hands released the door frame, and she had to brace herself against the wall to keep from falling. Marin went to her. She said, "How long have you been standing here?" Rosalind Pike said, "Since she asked me whether Wesley was home yet." That was all she ever said about it, then or afterward. She didn't explain what she'd done, how she'd managed to push that bed inside by herself, how she'd bolted the door, how many minutes she'd stood there, how many people had tried to get past her. She said only that sentence, then looked at her son and sat down on the hallway floor, and Wesley knelt beside her. Marin knocked on the storage room door, said her name, and heard the bolt slide back. Adelaide Ferrante was lying on the bed that had been pushed into the middle of the cardboard boxes, turned onto her left side, a pillow wedged behind her back. The head of the bed lowered to exactly the angle Marin had worked out long ago. Someone had done it right. Marin looked at the way the old woman had been positioned and understood that the woman who'd sold this house to outsiders for 3 weeks was also the woman who'd stood inside that sick room often enough to remember where the pillow had to go. The old woman opened her eyes and said, "You're late." Emmett Doyle handled the rest of that night, and he never told anyone the details, and no one asked. Aldo Bracco didn't leave the state. That was all Elias Ferrante said about it 3 days later, and he said it in the flat voice Marin had learned to recognize as the most frightening thing about him. During those 3 days, everything seemed to be moving toward where it needed to go. Margaret Sowell had received the hard drive and was working with an attorney and an independent technical expert to authenticate its contents before anything was released. Then, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, she called. Elias took the call in the living room while Marin stood 3 steps away, and she watched his face as he listened, and she knew before he even lowered the phone. He said, "It's encrypted," she said. "We knew it was encrypted," he said. "Not the kind of encryption people can break. A 24-character key, stored nowhere, no backup, no recovery question. My father set it up 30 years ago." He placed the phone on the table. "Without the key, it's a piece of plastic." The entire room went silent, and Marin was the one who said aloud what everyone had already understood. She said, "The key is in her head." Elias asked his mother 3 times over the next 2 days. The first time, she said she'd remember. Just let her think. The second time, she recited 7 characters and stopped, and those 7 characters were wrong. The third time was on the evening of the 2nd day, and Marin stood in the doorway because she had no reason to be there, except that she was the only person allowed inside that room. Elias sat beside his mother's bed and held her hand. He said very softly, "Mom, I'm sorry. I know I've asked you too many times already, but I need you to try one more time." Adelaide Ferrante looked at her son. She opened her mouth, and nothing came out. She tried again. Then she said, "I'm sorry." She said it 3 times, each one harder than the last. I'm sorry, son." And then the woman who'd sat at the dining table in that house for 30 years and carried its entire structure inside her mind, without ever needing to write down a single word, began to cry because she couldn't remember. It was the worst thing Elias Ferrante had ever had to watch. He held his mother's hand a little longer. He told her it was all right, that it didn't matter, that she should sleep. Then he stood, walked out of the room, and didn't come back for 6 hours. Marin Hollis didn't go looking for Elias during those 6 hours. She sat beside the old woman's bed and did her work. And while she did her work, she thought about something she'd known for 9 years and had never once had reason to use. Memory didn't disappear all at once. It disappeared in layers, and those layers had an order. The things that went first were proper names, dates, events, the things stored in the part of the mind a person had to reach into deliberately to retrieve. The things that went last were rhythm and habit, sequences of movement and sound repeated thousands of times until the body learned them in place of the mind. That was why someone who could no longer remember the name of her own child could still sit down and play an entire piece of music. That was why you never asked a patient at this stage directly. You didn't ask. You brought them back into the old rhythm and let the rhythm do the work. 3 o'clock in the morning. Marin pulled her chair closer to the bed, switched on the small lamp, and opened the local newspaper to the last page. She said nothing about the key, the hard drive, Elias, or anything that had happened over the previous 3 days. She began reading the obituaries, exactly as she'd done for 423 nights before. An 81-year-old retired electrician, a woman who'd taught 3rd grade for 34 years, a man with 7 grandchildren and a small boat, and Adelaide Ferrante, lying on her left side beneath the bedside light, commented on each one in her slow, broken voice, just as she always had. She said the teacher must have been terrible at her job, because when people wrote an obituary that long, they were trying to make up for something else. She said the man with the boat had lived properly. Marin finished one column, then turned to the second. And in the middle of that rhythm, without changing her voice, without looking up, she said very softly, "Read it to me, that string of characters. Read it the way you always do." And the old woman did. 24 characters, letters and numbers alternating, spoken straight through in the steady voice of someone who'd recited them thousands of times over 30 years. Her eyes still fixed on the ceiling, her hands still resting on the blanket, reciting them the way someone recites a prayer whose meaning they no longer have to think about. Not one character wrong. Marin wrote it down in the leather-bound notebook with the worn corners, the notebook no one had ever read. Then the old woman turned toward her and asked, "Who are you?" Marin told her name. The old woman nodded and told her to keep reading. In the doorway, Elias Ferrante stood without stepping inside. No one knew how long he'd been there. He'd lived for 34 years inside the houses belonging to this family, and had never understood that what held them together wasn't power and wasn't money, but one person willing to remain seated at 3 o'clock in the morning and read the newspaper aloud to his mother. 4 days later, Margaret Sowell finished verifying everything. Elias knew the price and didn't bargain with it. He told Marin his lawyer had calculated it already. 7 years, maybe 9, and he said it in the voice of a man reading a damage report. He said, "My father left this to me when I was 19, and it took me 15 years to understand that I can't fix it. All I can do is close it down." Then he told her about the small house on Wickenden Street, about the loan application that had been denied 8 months earlier because of her credit history rather than the project's viability, and he made it very clear that he wasn't giving her money. He wasn't creating a debt. He was correcting one specific injustice he had the ability to correct, with no strings attached and nothing expected in return. She asked, "Then what are we after this?" He said, "I don't know." She said, "That's an honest answer." Adelaide Ferrante died on a January morning, without pain, her hand in Marin's, exactly as she'd asked the previous autumn. In March, the house on Wickenden Street opened its doors. 4 beds, a small kitchen, a hallway with chairs. There was no sponsor's name on the door. On opening morning, the 2 children from next door brought over a pot of yellow chrysanthemums and a sign they'd written themselves in marker, with the word welcome slanting badly off to one side because they'd run out of space by the final letter. Marin hung the sign on the door and left it there for years. On the first night, a 68-year-old man left his wife there and went home and slept for 8 full hours, the first time he'd done so in 11 months. There are people the whole world has quietly agreed aren't worth seeing. The night nurse, the person pushing the medication cart at 3 o'clock in the morning, the one who stays behind after everyone else has gone home. They're the people who keep this world from collapsing, and they do it without anyone applauding. A person's dignity doesn't come from something another person gives them. It comes from refusing to run when running would be the most reasonable thing in the world. And there are things in life that remain safe only as long as we're willing to make ourselves small, until one day the cost of staying small becomes greater than the cost of stepping into the light. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with someone you think needs to hear it, so that every day you can have stories that are truly worth hearing. We'd truly love to know how you feel about Marin and Adelaide's story, so please leave a comment and tell us what part of this story stayed in your heart the longest. We wish you and your family good health, peaceful days, and happiness. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.